This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me, as always, is my co-host Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Kimberly Giarratano. She is the author of, look, I'm going to give two of your book title names. You have a lot. I love your book titles. When I was going through your Amazon page, it was like, man, these titles are amazing, and I need to really work on this part of my craft. So she is the author of Death of a Dancing Queen, which is out, and she has a new book out coming in May, Devil in Profile. And look, those are, I'm not kidding. I'm not just, like feeding you lines here. All of your titles, I just loved them. I felt like if I were about to read these books, I know what I'm getting into based on the title.
I have a funny story about Death of a Dancing Queen, just because it was a throwaway title.
Nice.
It was originally called The Malta Club, and my agent asked me to retitle it at some part of the submissions process, and the publisher that it's published with now, Datura Books, my editor wanted to change the title, but she said the sales department loved it too much. Because I was like, yes, I thought an editor was going to change it. I was like, I'm not married to you. Devil in Profile, though, I'm proud of that one. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm proud of all my titles, but I was like, damn, this is a good one. And I'm working on the third book right now, and I think I have a good title for that. We'll see if it sticks. They'll tell me.
Yeah, they'll tell you. And I had, like, for my last two books, I started off with the titles that I thought I was going to go with and ultimately did go with. But along the way, I tried out a half a dozen different ones before I came back, and I even tested them with people. I was like, hey, here's the book, here's what it's about, here's the title I was working from. And they all came back with my last two books were Casual Business with Fairies, and the one that's coming out in April is Watch Party. And people were like, I like the one, this one. I'm like, all right, fine, we'll go with that.
Yeah, I don't usually workshop them. I'm just like, I came up with this great idea.
Titles are hard. I made the mistake with my Rosemont series. Coming to Rosemont was the first one, and I stuck with the ing word to begin with through the book 7, and then I'm like, I am done. Plus, you have to make sure that they don't conflict with other titles or something else that might lead people on Amazon, and it's just a nightmare. So I kind of did a different convention for the last two. But that's probably my least favorite thing. Right next to doing the blurb is doing the title. Not a fan.
Those are my favorite because that means I'm either done or haven't started yet.
There you go.
Well, I will tell you something that I ran across with Watch Party, because you're talking about other titles. Is I didn't find any other books by that name, which is great. But what, and I, in spite of what I'm about to say, I went ahead and stuck with it. But if you just do a search for that, it pulled up a lot of like voyeuristic kinds of spicy books. Which
Tracks.
Yeah, I did. That didn't occur to me, but there were no other books by that particular title, so I just went with it. But that's another thing to watch out for when you're titling is what are things that it's associated with. All right. So Kim, we are here today to talk about using a 4-act structure to craft a story. I know the conventional wisdom is 3-act structures. I use a semi 4-act structure that I learned from Sean Coyne, and it's effectively 3 acts, but the middle act 2 is broken in half. And so I'm curious about what a 4-act structure looks like from you and setting that foundation for us for this conversation.
Sure. So I might, I have notes on my computer. I might jump to them because you remember, but I want to say first and foremost, any structure is good. That's conventional. Any structure is conventional. That's my opinion. And I would argue that the second act broken in chunks would turn it into a 4-act structure. But so I'm just gonna look at a tab. But I did not invent this. I stumbled upon this there was a blog post written by John P. Murphy from 2014, and he described this in this post. He calls it a 4-act structure, or the two-body plot, because they're typically two corpses.
Mhm.
And he credits this structure to P.D. James, the world, the British famed novelist, and something that she used quite frequently. So if you've ever caught her Dalgleish show, I haven't read her books, I'm embarrassed to say, but I have seen Dalgleish on Acorn TV. You'll get a sense for the structure too, even in the way the television show is, because there's always a second body that drops at the second act. So that's typically where it goes. So there are obviously 4 acts. Do you just want me to describe the whole structure?
Yeah, let's describe it,
sure.
and then we'll break
Yeah.
it down from there. I think that may be the easiest way to do it.
Okay. So there are 4 acts, obviously. First thing to note is they are not all equal in size. The first act is where we are introduced the protagonist to her. I'm using her because just for the sake of simplicity, to her cast of friends, her family, her personality, her problems, where she is in life, where she wants to be, her story flaw, that sort of thing. So we're getting a taste of the arc. Also, during the first act, we are going to set it up for a crime to occur. And I'd say it could really happen wherever you want in the act, but the further you push it off a little bit, the more you can build up the suspense and the dread and go, somebody's going down. We'll also be introduced to the suspects in the first act. Now, we don't know they're the suspects. The reader might not go, oh, that's a suspect, but they're there, they're floating around, because rule number 1 of whodunits is you got to bring in those suspects early. And so all of this is sort of happening. We're setting the scene, we're setting up for the crime, all happening in the first act. And I argue that the act ends when the protagonist decides, I'm taking on this case, I'm going to solve this murder, I'm going to solve this mystery. It's my job. And that's when I end that first act. That's how I know. And then I get into act 2, and act 2 is what I call like heading in the obvious direction, but not necessarily the right direction. So if a married woman is murdered, police are automatically going to look at the spouse as a suspect. If a prima ballerina is murdered, an investigator might look at her understudy, we're always going to, or the protagonist, is going to look in the most obvious of directions, where their gut leads at first. And there also might be some biases that play into this. For example, if a protagonist's relative dies, and they suspect the spouse, but she's like, no, he's my cousin and he's the nicest guy on the planet. There's no way he could have done this. She's going to purposefully start looking in a different direction because there's, her biases are going to get in the way. So that second act is usually where the protagonist is collecting clues. She's interviewing suspects. She's being lied to. She may not know why. She's uncovering things, but she's headed in a direction. And this is where our red herrings come in. And at the end of the second act, we get that second corpse, we get that second body, we get another murder. And this victim is going to change her understanding of the entire investigation as it happens. This victim could be a suspect that she really felt like was the one. And now that they're murdered, the whole crime is thrown into question. So now we head into, and that's the end of act 2. Dead body, second body, drop it. We're done with act 2. Now we're going to move on to act 3. Now in act 3, our protagonist is headed in the right direction. She has changed her focus, but she's more determined now. So she's re-interviewing suspects. She's calling them out on their BS. And at this point, the antagonist is getting nervous. Now the antagonist is worried because, they're feeling like it's getting too close. So the antagonist gets nervous, but they get dangerous. So the third act is a great opportunity to add in danger, conflict, and I always add in the all is lost moment for my protagonist in the third act, where they're just like, I don't think I can do this. And then at the end of the third act, we have the confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist, where we reveal everything, the murderer. And then they have their face off. And I'm hoping at this point of the story, my readers have just gotten to it before I reveal it, like a couple of, ideally they're like a page before, but who knows. And then the fourth act is everything that kind of follows after. It is the shortest of the 4 acts, the fourth act. For me, it's quite short because it's just how everything plays out. We're answering questions we may not have answered before, revealing some subplots, maybe little questions we didn't answer. You know, a police detective saying, how'd you know he'd be in the shed? It'd be like, well, I follow the trail of blood droplets or something. But that's how we would end it. And the other thing I like to use for the fourth act too is if I know I'm writing another book after in the series, I can kind of set it up. Sometimes I do that, which is a lot of fun. That's kind of it.
All right. So I will say in the structure that I use, which is effectively 4 acts, what I have found beneficial is that, you know, a lot of times people think, okay, act 1 is roughly 25%. Act 2, if you're using 3 acts, is roughly 50%, and act 3 is the last quarter. And you have this murky middle where things get bogged down. Whereas if you're using 4 acts, there isn't really that murky middle where things start to sag because you don't have that huge chunk of the story that allows it to get bogged down. And so that's been really beneficial to me, is to compartmentalize each of these. And I try to have my literary words are leaving me here. I'm going to pull up my spreadsheet real quick because I'm talking. In each of my acts, I have an inciting incident and a progressive complication and a crisis and a climax and a resolution. And, you know, they are all components of the story, so that there's something that has to happen before we can move on to the next stage of the story, like you were describing.
Yes. And I also, my acts are not, like I said, they're not equal. My act 1 is typically only 15%. And I would say acts 2 and 3 are each at 40%. And then act 5 is only 5%. Because after you figure out who the murderer is, readers are like, all right, I'm done. You know,
Yeah, you're just winding it down.
Yeah. So I don't spend a lot of time. So if I'm looking at a 75 to 90,000 word novel, usually my sweet spot, my act 4 could be 5,000 words maybe. So it's not too much. But what I have found, prior to stumbling upon this blog post, I guess I was writing my mysteries quite intuitively, and they were working for the most part. I mean, I don't think my first book, obviously, I had to really restructure because that was my learning novel. But I think what the structure really allowed me to do is play into the trope of the red herrings, which I wasn't super knowledgeable about. I was like, well, we have to get suspicion off this guy because that's who did it, and I don't want them to guess too early. And then how do I do that? But the structure has just really allowed me to just organize my thoughts better and to plot easier. But you don't have to be, I think, a plotter to use this. In revisions, I think it would work pretty well to be like, wait, did I drop a second body at this part? How far am I in where I dropped the second body? Does it make sense? Did I drop that body here? And I do think it keeps the pacing on point as well. For sure.
Are you a plotter? Pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I figured.
I mean, I'm not a great, I plot all the time, but sometimes I will overplot. I overplot all the time. And then I have to kind of clean that up too when I go through. But I found the structure makes it so that I'm not really doing structural revisions.
Okay.
I find
helpful.
It is helpful.
Yeah. So how long does that take you? How long does it take you to write a book?
Oh, I procrastinate a lot. I'm not really a good example of
Okay.
I mean, I have a book. I mean, I'm on contract now, so it's nice having a deadline somebody else imposed that I am not So I have a deadline in May. So I've been drafting. I wrote a really crappy first kind of draft during Nano, and now I'm going back and fixing everything that was wrong with it, and it's a lot, but I'll get it done in time. I'm not really worried about it.
All right. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, so for me, when I am creating my framework for my story, a lot of which I do as I go and looking ahead a few chapters, or like for the book that I'm writing now, I'm closing in on the halfway point. I knew going in what was likely to happen in the first act. I kind of figured out the second act as I went. I know generally what is going to happen in really broad strokes.
I was gonna
In
sneeze, sorry.
no, you're good.
I was
In
like, I think I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry. I think it passed.
Okay. I know generally what's going to happen in the last quarter of the book, but I still don't know what's going to happen in the third quarter of the book. I'll figure that out before too long. But for me, I keep up with all of that in a spreadsheet that I created. And so for Watch Party that's coming out, it's a murder mystery, and there were like 8 or 9 people who died, and so I had to flag like by using cell colors, like where I dropped bodies. Otherwise, there was no way I could remember who died when and where and all that. So, how do you structure your organizational part of your story to be able to keep up with it as you go?
Well, I use Scrivener. So I have a template that I created where I have just 4 file folders, so I know the acts. I was working today in Scrivener and going through it. So in my book right now that I'm drafting, my act 1 is really large, larger than I intend for it to be, and I'm a little concerned. So that's to say, like, sometimes your structure, you might push the boundaries a little bit of where things fall or what you're doing to lead up. I had someone read it. I'm like, are you bored? But I do use Scrivener. So Scrivener's wonderful. I don't think I can draft without it. I have created an Excel spreadsheet to do scenes, which I've done a webinar on this a couple of times for Sisters in Crime. And I've shown like what an Excel spreadsheet could look like using this structure. So I've done that. The nice thing is with Scrivener in particular, so I break it up into my acts, and then I'll put, like, in parentheses, I'll put a number, like how many scenes I think this act should take, 25, that kind of thing. And then I can create scene cards where I'm like, okay, second body. Like and it's usually what it's labeled, second body. Or I can do a scene card, point of no return or lowest moment kind of thing, and showdown. And then I just have to make sure that I'm leading to that point, that I'm getting there. I always know who the victim is. I always know who the killer is. I don't typically start books going, oh, it could be this person or that person. I'm usually pretty good about it. And even when I'm drafting, I'm like, I can write the 4th act because I know how it will end. I always have my beginning and ending clear as day. The nice thing about the 4-act structure for that murky middle is you should have a second body thrown in. That is, and that your protagonist, and this goes for any whodunit, police procedural, cozy, anything, that at the end of that, that second act is going to be kind of a bit of, I don't want to say floundering, because the protagonist thinks that they're going in the right direction, but they're not. So it's sort of a fact-finding mission that's not well organized. Or, so I feel like you could set up, even if, let's say you're doing index cards, you're not a Scrivener user and you're doing index cards, you can do your index cards just like you would, you can write second body, and then you can put them in order like a deck of cards and lay them out and then work from that way.
So when you're in Scrivener, which I use, but not in the way that you're describing, do you have the kinds of scenes that need to occur within each act? Like I know you mentioned the point of no return and second body. Do you have that? I'm trying to figure out. Are there hard and fast rules that you have for each act about things that need to occur, or is that more something you keep internally? Like I know that you mentioned that in your first few books before you found this structure that you were doing it more intuitively. So do you know in your head these are the things that have to occur within Act 1 and then Act 2, or is that organized and written down and noted in Scrivener?
Well, I've done it so often now that it's when I'm outlining, when I'm plotting, I'm like in my first act. Usually the first act doesn't take much plotting, for me. It's that I love the first act. It writes itself. I'm like, oh, let's meet our contestants. And it's acts 2 and 3 that drive me absolutely crazy. Which drive every author crazy. You're like, oh, I gotta write the middle part. And the middle part's the biggest chunk. It's like 75% of the novel. But yeah, I mean, I do, and I will write scene cards in Scrivener that say, this is what's happening. Just so you know, Kim, this is what's happening. And I don't know if anything's a hard and fast rule, but to make sure that so here's a good example. In book 2, which will be out in May, I followed my structure, and then my editors, actually, I had a friend read it and she's like, it's too breakneck at the end, so you're gonna have to move things. And I was like, oh, that kind of screws my structure. And then my editor read it and she's like, it's too breakneck at the end, you need to move your structure. So I did have to finagle some things a little bit around. So even if I have a hard, fast rule, my editor will be like, no, you got to fix this. But typically I have found this just works with, and I'll even say that revision where I had to move stuff, it wasn't that big a deal. I really was just like scrunching it further up. I just had action happen. It wasn't that big a deal. It did not take me a long time to do. It did not like destroy anything, because the bones are still good, in my opinion.
So do you write, your book sort of chronologically beginning to end, or do you ever, fast forward to, the low point or whatever, some big dramatic moment to get it set up and then go back in and write to it?
I do both. Sometimes
Yeah.
I'll just write linearly. And then sometimes I'm like, you know what, I'm in the mood for, to write a conflict scene, or I want to see how it plays out, or sometimes I will write the confrontational scene because I want to see how the villain describes what they did. So then I know what the actual murder looked like. I always put in my Scrivener file, like, murder scene from the POV of the victim, murder scene from the POV of the villain, so that I have an idea. I don't always follow through and write those scenes,
Yeah.
but I find that they're quite helpful and they're fun, because oftentimes the victim's POV would never be in my book,
Right.
because the POV for my Billy Levine series is from Billy Levine's point of view. So I would never see the victim, insert victims in this point of view. So it's a lot of fun to kind of do, but I do recommend it. I mean, I think it's a great writing exercise to write your crime scene through the POV of your antagonist and your victim.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I had my second book. It was the second in a series. It was a fantasy novel, but there was a big serial killer plot. And I decided I had several scenes from the point of view of my villain, including a murder scene. And I thought this will be fun to write, this murder scene from the person who is doing it. And it was, until it got really dark and really grim. And by the end of it, I was like, I think I would not like to do that again. But, it was really interesting. But I hadn't thought of doing it from the point of view of the victim, like you're describing. But I can see where that would really provide context and nuance and some things that you wouldn't otherwise have considered. And I think that's really interesting.
It also provides motive. So, like, let's say you write it through the POV of the killer. You could be like, does the motive work? Does this make sense? It's, when they're, finally going after the victim, and, they're like, I'm here to kill you because, like, does the motive work? Does the methods work? That's a whole nother thing. Does the methods make sense? And then for the victim, also, I guess, it would just be to get into their head a little bit to see, how did we get to this point in the story? And what does the victim know that your protagonist doesn't at that point either? What's the big secret here? So I'm working on a historical mystery, not really at the moment because I'm writing my third Billy book, but I did have a scene with the victim, and to see what was the big secret here that my protagonists don't know. So I had a lot of fun with that. I just think it's fun. It's an exercise. It's not getting into the book. It's not adding to word count, but it does allow me to really understand where my story is. So I always put it in the template, and I ignore it sometimes, and sometimes I run with it.
All right. So one of the things I saw when I was looking at kind of about a presentation you did last year at on this topic is that you mentioned that folks who are not plotters, who are pantsers or discovery writers, can also use this method after drafting. And I'm really curious about that.
Yes. So I feel like I gotta, yeah, because I had done this presentation a couple of times and I do it in conjunction with like what an Excel spread, like how you can use Excel to do this. If you either have Scrivener, you don't have Scrivener, you can use Excel. And I know there are many people who are discovery writers, which I like that term. And this is how you would use this in revision. So the 4-act structure could be your goals, your tent poles, whatever, your goalposts, whatever you need to aim for. And you can then see when you're doing your revision. All right, let's see, let me look at okay, I'm 15% in. Is that where my protagonist is like, I'm solving this crime, I'm taking up this investigation, I'm on it? No? Is it more like, 8, like, is it 50% in? Ooh, that's not gonna work. My pacing's off. So you can check that way. And you can, as you're revising, go, okay, is my protagonist collecting information, but not really on the right track here? No, and then, I think she figured it out too early. I got to move that scene, or I got to move that clue, or that clue's not going to work there. Do I have my red herring, where I need it to be? No, I don't. So I got to move it. So, discovery writers write by intuition. They let the story take them where they want. But when they go back through revision, they become blotters. They don't have a choice. They have to make sure A connects to B and B connects to C. So one of the things I suggested was, if you're plotting, if you're like, I really want to plot, you can use that Excel spreadsheet, and each, you can do scenes. And then when you go back, and I want to see if I have it, I can pull up, but when you go back and you're a discovery writer and you're doing revisions, you could plug in your information scene by scene, because I don't write in chapters, I write in scenes. I have a friend, she's a romance writer, she writes in chapters. I'm just like, the building blocks of my books are scenes. And then chapters are later. I don't even care about chapters. But I go scene by scene, and that's what a discovery writer can do during revision, is go scene by scene and say, okay, POV, what's the conflict here? Is this heading in the right direction? If not, what do I need to do to fix it? But, at that point, you become more almost of an investigator of your own book, because you have to go through combing through the information and going, did I accomplish what I have to do? Nope. And I got to fix it. I find my method for me means I don't have to do any of that at the end. Yeah. I don't. Usually, when I am done, I am doing superficial revisions. I am making my language the way I like it. Fussing with language. I like to fuss with my language. Maybe going, ooh, what did we get a clue? Slipping in a clue somewhere that I think would work better for me. But I am not having to do a hardcore comb through my scenes, really looking for continuity or problems and things like that.
Yeah. And for me, and I don't know about you, Barb, I certainly want to know, but I've found the same. I mean, I've only written 5 novels at this point, but that has been my experience as well, is that because I have the framework and I am consistently writing toward the tent poles and knowing the things that I have to accomplish in each section of the book, that it is organized and structured in the manner that I want it to be. So most of the editing is line editing. Once that first draft is line editing, it's futzing about with language that I want to use, all that sort of thing. It is not finding developmental problems. And in part, I send, and I know Barb does this part, I send my stuff out in chunks to an alpha reader. And get feedback as I'm going, which enables me to correct that stuff as I go. For example, in the book that I'm writing now, I sent her a chunk of chapters and she sent me some feedback, and she was like, hey, I don't think this character would do what you have them doing. That's not consistent with what they've done up to this point, and that doesn't seem appropriate for who they are. And so I went back and looked and agreed and made some changes that, if I had let that go, and not had her reading it, that may have had similar changes along the way that would have required much broader changes, going back. So I'm with you on that and the benefits of knowing your structure and working with your structure as you go. For me, and certainly it's everybody has their own thing, but that's why it benefits me as well.
It's so much faster and so much more efficient to have a structure that you're following. And it isn't, I outline, and it isn't that I don't change things. Sometimes as I'm writing, a character will develop in a different way and I'll make changes. But when I'm done with that first draft, I'm then moving into, language issues, not, oh gosh, we forgot a subplot, or, oh, this, none of that stuff. So it just makes it faster to get into print.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And that's not to say I don't discover things as I write. When I started my third book, I discovered a character. Like the first scene, I was like, oh, I think I just introduced somebody I'm going to keep for a while. I didn't intend to do that. So, having goals, like little goalposts, like, or tent poles, where you're headed. It helps. And for me, I'd just be floundering. But I think even discovery writers have structure. I think they just don't think of it as such.
I think you're right. Also, if you're prone to writer's block, which I'm not, although there are days when you're like, really not feeling anything, but it's a writing day and I'm a writer. This is my business, so I'm going to write. It's helpful to have that out there because in effect, you're outlined, because then you know where you're going.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah. So it helps in productivity in so many ways.
All right. So Kim, before we go, I want to make sure people know where to find you, the work that you're doing. If you have any upcoming presentations that you're doing, all of that, if you can share with folks where to find you.
Sure. I'm online, just like everybody else. It's Kimberly G, Giarratano.com, Giarratano. I'm on the National Board for Sisters in Crime. So lately, presentations that I've been doing have been like how to use the online community. If there are listeners who are not members of Sisters in Crime, you should be. It is an organization 35 years old. It started out as an advocacy group for female crime writers to get their fair share of attention. And now we've expanded our mission and our advocacy work. We welcome people of all genders, all backgrounds, everywhere. And I often like to say that Sisters in Crime is a great organization to join, even if you are not a mystery or crime fiction writer. We have numerous webinars and educational opportunities for writing. So while many of our members are crime fiction authors, we really can help writers in any genre whatsoever. So I always encourage people to check us out at sistersincrime.org. But yeah, I'm not really hanging around Twitter too much anymore, but I'm on Threads. I really am enjoying Threads. You can find me there at Kim Garnick Giarratano. Garnick's my maiden name. I'm giving way too much information.
No, yeah. Well, I've been doing Threads too over the last few months, and I'm still working on the algorithm, putting in front of me the things that I want to see, but which requires a lot of not clicking on things that I might be interested in, because then it's like the next 40 things in my feed or those things. But it's been really picking up a lot of steam lately. I think that's been good.
I get more interaction on Threads than I ever did on Twitter, and I have way less followers on Threads because it's kind of new. But I like to talk a lot of authoring and writing and things like that. So, but yeah, if you like Private Eye series set in New Jersey, I'm your girl. Death of a Dancing Queen. The second book, Devil Profile, will be out in May. I'm very excited about it. But yeah, that's kind of. I don't know if I'm doing any more. I haven't been tasked for any more presentations on the 4-act structure, but I'm open to it because I do love talking craft and I'm extroverted, so it's usually a good combination.
Well, I think I've really enjoyed this conversation. I mean, yeah, I like being able to have craft conversations and then go back and compare it with what am I doing and should I consider, supplementing or making changes, that sort of thing. So I've really appreciated it.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, we're all learning constantly. Even several novels under our belt. We're like, wait, I could use that method. That might help me somewhere.
Yeah.
You made it very accessible, very approachable.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and if anybody wants to see it written down, like you could just Google John P. Murphy two-body plot. That blog post will come up right away, and he gives a bit. It gives an overview of stuff, or pull up a P.D. James book. I just learned she died in 2014 at the age of like 94.
Oh, wow.
I know. I have to read more Dalglish. I do like the show. I watch a lot of British crime dramas. They're pretty good.
Yeah, me too. Love them.
I know. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. Appreciate your flexibility too.
Yeah.